again. Miranda Devine, New York Post columnist and Fox News contributor, now joining us as well. First, give us your broad take, or your first take, I should say, on what you have heard so far in that hearing room, Miranda.
Look, I think Merrick Garland is not doing a very good job of reassuring, half of America or more that the Department of Justice is not implementing an unfair two-tier justice system. He just declared that he didn't care whether crimes were committed by the right or the left. But, Jim Jordan has asked him a couple of questions which put that into question. For instance, Jim Jordan asked him about the environmental activists who forced their way into the Department of the Interior in DC recently. And he said, do you call them domestic terrorists like you called the January 6 rioters domestic terrorists? And Merrick Garland just says, I didn't know anything about the Department of Interior incident. So he's deflecting these questions, and he doesn't really seem to care that there is a problem out there in the community where the public is seeing the Department of Justice sicking the FBI onto mums and dads in school board meetings. And Merrick Garland, in the answer to one of his questions, says, that the entire basis of his memo sicking the FBI onto mums and dads was a left-wing organisation's letter, the National School Boards Association letter. He had no body of evidence to show that there was violence in these meetings. It was just that letter, plus he said a few newspaper reports. That's really disturbing, and it shows you that Merrick Garland maybe isn't even aware of his own bias and the bias within his own Justice Department. And the other issue, I think, about the school boards is that he was saying that he didn't himself have a meeting with the White House about these school board meetings, or that he didn't consult with the National School Board Association before they wrote that letter that had this amazing action within 5 days from the Department of Justice and from the Attorney General himself. But he said he didn't know if anybody else in the Department of Justice was coordinating with the White House and the National School Boards Association. That's just not good enough. And I don't understand why he doesn't come armed with data and information, or at least an assistant who can prompt him. That's what happens in other arenas. It just seems pointless to have these hearings where the administration appointees are not held accountable.
Yeah, and it's pretty clear as well, Miranda, that the action in terms of the memo from the Attorney General to the FBI came after the National School Boards Association did petition the president for relief. Of course, the argument is made, why do you need to have the FBI looking into this across the country when local law enforcement are fully capable of dealing with this? Why do you need to invoke the Patriot Act when local laws would likely be sufficient? And then what constitutes domestic terrorism? Let's listen to an exchange. This is cut number 2 that Ohio Congressman Steve Chabot had with the Attorney General. Listen here.
One example of a so-called terrorist incident was a parent merely questioning whether school board members had earned their high school diplomas. Now, that might have been rude, but does that seem like an act of domestic terrorism that you or your Justice Department ought to be investigating?
Absolutely not, and I want to be clear. The Justice Department supports and defends the First Amendment right of parents to complain as vociferously as they wish.
The Attorney General, Miranda, says that people have the First Amendment right to protest as vociferously as they wish. Meantime, the National School Boards Association is soliciting the expertise and resources of the U.S. Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. Secret Service, and its National Threat Assessment Center. I mean, it sounds like al-Qaeda is at these school board meetings, not parents.
Exactly. It's really sinister. And I think Jim Jordan again nailed the question to Merrick Garland when Garland just could not answer whether he initially said no, they weren't domestic terrorist mums and dads, but then why was he employing the National Security Division of the Department of Justice to go after these school board meetings? He said, Merrick Garland said, no, we're not going to be sending the FBI to these school board meetings. But again, why are they employing all the apparatus of the Department of Justice, which is used against domestic terrorism, which is meant to be Al Qaeda and these threats to our life and limb, employing them against parents just expressing their desire to control what is taught to their children, and they don't want critical race theory, etc. And, it really is problematic about Merrick Garland's son-in-law selling these curricula that the parents are objecting to. And, if there is nothing untoward, and we give him the benefit of the doubt that there isn't, he should go through some sort of ethics process to demonstrate to all the people that are calling his credibility into question that there is nothing wrong here. I mean, that's what you do. It's not just about not being unethical. It's about not giving the appearance of being unethical. And he, above everybody, should know. You just get the impression that this is a man who really doesn't know what is going on in the Department of Justice. Now, fair enough, he's only been there perhaps a few months. Maybe he hasn't had a chance yet to figure it out. But there are a lot of appointees now by the Biden administration that are partisan political activists, and they're using the levers of the Department of Justice against the enemies or the political foes of the president. And Merrick Garland, if he means what he says about being a non-partisan Attorney General, then he needs to get on top of that straight away, because his Department of Justice is being used to target mums and dads who are opposed to the sort of left-wing propaganda being sent to their children. It's being used against political opponents of Joe Biden, against Trump supporters. And, he had nothing to say about the abuse that's being meted out by guards in a DC jail against those rioters or those defendants from the January 6 riots who are being held for months without trial and who are complaining, their lawyers are complaining, that they are being abused by really sadistic guards in DC. There's no reason for them to have been sent in DC. And Merrick Garland is not going to do an inspection. He was asked if he would, and he said, well, he was non-committal, but it looked like a no to me.
Yeah, because it was a local issue. And you think that on the subject of his son-in-law, it would be a simple thing for the Attorney General to say, look, I welcome a review of this by the Ethics Division of the Department of Justice. I've got nothing to hide here. So,
exactly.
Have at it.
Yeah,
Miranda,
easy.
good to talk to you. Thanks for your perspective on things.
Thank you, Miranda.